Imagine a cookbook, a totally ordinary, everyday cookbook, filled with handwritten recipes for hearty stews, preserved fruits, and traditional pastries, jotted down a little over a century ago. It sounds entirely harmless. But now, imagine that this exact cookbook is currently locked away, inside a heavy lead-lined box, in a basement in Paris. If you wanted to read it today, you could not simply walk in, open the cover, and look for a dinner idea. You would literally have to sign a strict liability waiver, acknowledging that doing so might kill you. You would have to be sealed inside a specialized, full-body hazmat suit, because this completely mundane collection of recipes is so incredibly deadly, so fundamentally altered at the atomic level, that it will remain dangerously radioactive for the next 1,500 years. It is a staggering visual. The ultimate domestic, everyday object, transformed into something lethal. It is silently glowing with an invisible fire that will outlast civilizations. That ordinary cookbook belonged to Marie Curie. Before we journey deep into the shadows of the woman who wrote those recipes, take a moment to subscribe, like, and share this video. Here at Legendary Lives Unveiled, we thrive on bringing the most dramatic, unfiltered, and deeply human stories of history's titans directly to you, peeling back the layers of myth to reveal the searing truth beneath. Today, we must absolutely tear up the dusty, sanitized textbook image of the stoic, glowing scientist quietly working in a pristine lab. We are throwing that out. Instead, we will uncover the incredibly dramatic, highly controversial, and deeply human story of a woman who fought an oppressive global empire, endured crushing romantic heartbreak, survived a vicious national scandal that nearly destroyed her, and brought a revolutionary, invisible power into the world. A power that ultimately took her life, but not at all in the way you have always been told. To map out this exceptionally complex life, we are drawing from a highly diverse stack of sources, moving far beyond standard historical biographies. We are delving into official records from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, plunging into the archives of the American Institute of Physics, and crucially, examining a trove of very intimate personal letters. This includes a highly secretive, remarkably candid letter sent to her by Albert Einstein during the absolute darkest moment of her public life. To truly understand the physicist, you must first understand the geopolitical pressure cooker that forged her. Science was her ultimate refuge, a place of universal laws, because her own country made it illegal for her to even study it. We must wind the clock back to 1867. We do not start in the glamorous streets of Paris. We start in Warsaw, a city suffocating under the iron grip of the Russian Empire. To understand the woman who was actually born Maria Skłodowska, you must understand the crucible of 19th century Poland. At this point in history, Poland had been partitioned, essentially carved up by its powerful neighbors. Warsaw was firmly under Russian jurisdiction, and the Tsarist regime was actively enforcing a brutal, systematic policy known as Russification. This was not a mere changing of borders on a map. It was the deliberate eradication of Polish culture, language, and identity. For a family living through it, the terror was overwhelmingly practical. Russian inspectors would suddenly barge into elementary school classrooms to ensure absolutely no one was speaking Polish. Children were forced to learn Russian history in the Russian language. Teachers caught teaching Polish geography or literature were fired, or worse, exiled to Siberia. Maria's parents were squarely in the crosshairs of this cultural war, as they were both educators belonging to the Polish intelligentsia. This was a class that viewed learning, preserving history, and teaching the youth as literal acts of patriotic resistance. And that resistance carried a massive personal cost. Her father, a highly educated math and physics teacher, consistently harbored pro-Polish sentiments. Because he refused to bow to Russian supervisors, He was repeatedly demoted and eventually fired from his prestigious teaching posts. This plunged the Skudelska family into severe, grinding poverty. To survive, they transformed their cramped home into a chaotic dormitory, taking in student boarders just to put food on the table. But this economic hardship was immediately followed by unimaginable personal tragedy. When Maria was just 7 years old, her eldest sister Zofia contracted typhus, catching it directly from one of those very boarders they had taken in to survive. Zofia died. Then just 3 years later, when Maria was only 10 years old, her mother died of tuberculosis. It is a staggering sequence of losses for a child. The psychological impact of this era cannot be overstated. Her mother had been a deeply devout Catholic, but Maria, watching her mother suffer a slow, agonizing decline, followed by the arbitrary death of her sister, experienced a profound crisis of faith. It completely shattered her worldview. She abandoned Catholicism entirely, becoming a lifelong agnostic, and developed a skeptical, hyper-rationalist outlook on the physical world. The spiritual world had not protected her family. This trauma was the forge that built her ascetic resilience. The extreme, almost punishing discipline she later applied to her excruciating laboratory work in Paris was directly born from the trauma and absolute precariousness of her youth in Warsaw. History loves to praise her legendary focus, but one must ask, was her intense dedication actually a deep-seated trauma response? She lived in a world where the government could arbitrarily erase her culture, where her father could lose his livelihood for having the wrong thoughts, and where microscopic pathogens could simply delete her mother and sister from existence. Nothing was stable. The periodic table and the laws of physics became her only safe spaces. Science offered universal, immutable, mathematically provable laws. Gravity works the exact same way for a Russian czar as it does for a Polish schoolgirl. But the grand irony was that her path to studying those universal laws was entirely blocked by the arbitrary laws of the land. The Russian-controlled University of Warsaw strictly banned women from attending, so she literally went underground. She joined a clandestine underground educational network known in Polish as the Uniwersytet Latajicy, the Flying University. They were called Flying because they had to constantly move to evade the Tsarist secret police, holding secret lectures in private apartments, basements, and hidden rooms. It was a deeply patriotic institution that taught prohibited subjects, but crucially, it gave young women their only foundational advanced training in the natural sciences. But passion and secret basement lectures do not pay for professional laboratory space. Maria and her older sister, Bronislawa, realized they had hit a ceiling. Neither could afford the train ticket, let alone the tuition, to study in Western Europe. Out of sheer desperation, the sisters forged a brilliant, pragmatic pact. Maria agreed to completely put her own scientific dreams on hold. She entered the workforce as a governess, sending almost all her earnings to Paris to fund Bronislawa's medical school education. In return, once Bronislawa graduated and became a practicing physician, she would financially support Maria's move to Paris to study physics. This incredible act of sororal devotion led Maria directly into one of the most painful, humiliating chapters of her early life. For years, she worked in the remote countryside for a wealthy, aristocratic family, the Urowskis. During this intense isolation, she fell deeply, passionately in love with the family's eldest son, Kazimierz. He fell in love with her too, and they secretly became engaged, planning to marry. But when Kazimierz approached his parents, they absolutely shut it down. They were appalled. The reason was pure, unadulterated classism. Maria was brilliant, but she was poor. She was the help. In the rigid social hierarchy of 19th century rural Poland, you do not marry the governess. And Kazimierz, lacking the spine to stand up to his family, complied with their demands. He broke off the engagement, leaving Maria utterly and completely heartbroken. The letters she wrote in her absolute despair reveal a woman trapped, forced to continue working for the family that had just humiliated her, because she desperately needed the money for her sister's pact. Yet, historically speaking, this painful rejection is arguably one of the most pivotal moments in the entire history of modern science. Imagine if Kazimierz had possessed an ounce of actual backbone. If they had married, Maria Skudelska would have become a wealthy, aristocratic housewife managing an estate in rural Poland. The world never gets Marie Curie. The conceptual framework of radioactivity remains undiscovered. The atomic age is delayed, and foundational treatments for modern oncology are pushed back. Millions of cancer survivors today basically owe a debt of gratitude to the snobbery of a 19th century Polish family. Out of the ashes of that romantic rejection, she built an emotional fortress. She read dense physics and chemistry textbooks late into the night by candlelight in her tiny servant's room. And eventually, the pact paid off. Bronislawa graduated and established a medical practice in Paris. Finally, in late 1891, at the age of 24, Maria boarded a steam train. She left behind the trauma, the rejection, and the oppression of Warsaw, beginning her transformation into Marie of the Sorbonne. But if you picture a romantic montage of her strolling with a baguette in the Belle Époque, you must erase that image. For Marie, Paris was a test of severe physical endurance. She rented a freezing, unheated little garret in the Latin Quarter, living in extreme, brutal poverty. She survived on a diet of buttered bread, radishes, and tea, so malnourished that she fainted in class on several occasions. The winters were so bitterly cold that the water in her wash basin would freeze solid overnight. To keep from freezing to death in her sleep, she piled every single piece of clothing she owned, her towels, and even dragged her wooden chairs on top of her bed just to trap her body heat. She was essentially starving and freezing for physics, yet operating under conditions that would break almost anyone. Her intellectual output was staggering. In 1893, she completed her degree in physics, graduating first in her entire class. The following year, she earned a second degree in mathematics, finishing second. Operating in a male-dominated sphere, writing complex mathematical proofs in French, her second language, she consistently outperformed the best male minds in the country. It was a brilliant testament to the ascetic resilience forged in Warsaw. And right around this time, in the spring of 1894, while looking for extra laboratory space for a commissioned research project on the magnetic properties of steel, she experienced a collision of intellect and romance that would completely change the course of human history. She was searching for extra laboratory space to conduct a commissioned research project on the magnetic properties of various types of steel. A colleague introduced her to a prominent French physicist named Pierre Curie. Pierre was a fascinating character, about a decade older than Marie, having already made significant discoveries regarding piezoelectricity and magnetism. But personally, he had essentially given up on love. He had written in his diaries that women of genius were rare, believing he would never find a woman who cared about the pure pursuit of science as intensely as he did. He thought a wife would merely be a distraction from his laboratory. Until he met Marie. They did not bond over art or poetry. They bonded over an absolute, consuming, mutual obsession with the physical world and the laws that governed it. It was a true meeting of equals. Pierre was completely captivated by her intellect and lack of pretense, and they married in July of 1895 in a very simple civil ceremony. Marie did not even buy a wedding dress. She simply wore a dark blue outfit that she could repurpose later as a protective lab coat. Instead of a traditional, luxurious honeymoon, they used their wedding money to buy a pair of bicycles, spending the summer cycling through the French countryside, exploring nature, and talking about science. But they soon pivoted from bicycles to unlocking the fundamental mysteries of the universe. To truly grasp what Marie accomplished, we must establish the baseline of science in 1896. Classical physics was incredibly confident, believing the atom was the absolute smallest possible building block of matter. Think of it like a solid, indivisible billiard ball. It could not be broken down. It could not change. John Dalton's atomic theory was the prevailing gospel. Then, a French scientist named Henri Becquerel made an accidental discovery. He found that uranium salts emitted strange, invisible rays that could expose photographic plates, even when wrapped in thick black paper and kept in a dark drawer. But Becquerel could not explain the mechanism, and the broader scientific community essentially shrugged, distracted by the flashier, recent discovery of X-rays by Wilhelm Röntgen. Marie, however, was searching for a wholly original topic for her doctoral thesis. She decided to investigate Becquerel's mysterious uranium rays using a highly sensitive electrometer, invented years earlier by Pierre and his brother, which measured tiny electrical currents in the air. Methodically testing every known element, she discovered that thorium also emitted these rays. But here is the monumental, paradigm-shattering conceptual leap. She noted that the intensity of the radiation coming off the uranium compounds was directly proportional to the amount of uranium present. It did not matter what chemical state the uranium was in, whether it was a solid powder, dissolved in liquid, combined with other elements, heated up, or frozen. The radiation was constant. From this, she deduced that the radiation could not be the result of a chemical interaction between molecules. This was the critical revelation. She realized the radiation was coming from inside the atom itself. She boldly proposed that the atom was not a solid, unchanging billiard ball. It was unstable. It was breaking down. It was throwing off pieces of itself, ejecting vast hidden amounts of energy. And she literally invented a brand new word to describe this atomic behavior: radioactivity. We must appreciate the sheer magnitude of this hypothesis. She was single-handedly proposing a structural rewrite of the universe. She was stating that the fundamental building blocks of matter were mutable, but her genius was relentlessly practical. While testing a complex, heavy black ore called pitchblende, the raw material from which uranium was extracted, her electrometer went crazy. She realized the pitchblende was 4 times more radioactive than pure uranium itself. This presented a massive logical puzzle. If radioactivity is an atomic property, and pitchblende is mostly just uranium oxide mixed with inert rock, how could the raw ore be more radioactive than the pure element? Her brilliant deduction was that there must be an unknown, previously undiscovered element, something intensely radioactive, hiding in microscopic trace amounts inside the pitchblende. Pierre was so utterly captivated by the profound implications of her data that he completely abandoned his own established research on crystals to join forces with her. This decision led them into the most extreme, physically punishing scientific labor in history. Claiming a new element exists on paper is one thing, but the scientific community demanded proof. To isolate it and show its atomic weight, they procured tons of industrial waste pitchblende from a mine in Bohemia. They set up their operation in an abandoned, leaky, freezing dissection shed in the courtyard of Pierre's school. It had a dirt floor, skylights that let the freezing rain pour in, and virtually no ventilation. For the next 4 years, they engaged in heavy, grueling industrial labor using a process called fractional crystallization. Knowing the mystery element had chemical properties similar to barium, they would take heavy vats of this toxic radioactive sludge, treat it with harsh acids, and boil it. Marie would stand there, physically stirring these massive boiling cauldrons of acid and ore with a heavy iron rod that was almost as tall as she was, inside an unventilated shed. As the liquid cooled, the slightly more radioactive compounds would form crystals first. They separated those crystals, dissolved them in water, boiled it again, and let it cool again. They repeated this exact, exhausting process thousands and thousands of times. The physical toll was horrific. They breathed in caustic acid fumes and radon gas. They handled fiercely radioactive materials with their bare, unshielded hands, causing Marie's fingertips to constantly crack and peel. But their relentless, obsessive diligence paid off. They found two elements. In July 1898, Marie announced the discovery of the first element, naming it polonium. This was a deeply defiant political statement, named to remind the global scientific community of her erased, partitioned homeland of Poland, essentially using the periodic table as a platform for geopolitical resistance. Then, in December of that same year, they announced the second, even more radioactive element, radium. Still, the skeptical scientific establishment demanded pure radium. It took Marie another 3 solid years of stirring those cauldrons, processing literally tons of ore, to isolate just 1/10 of a single gram of pure radium chloride. That is roughly the size of a few grains of sand, extracted from a mountain of rock. The world finally noticed. In 1903, the Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded in recognition of their extraordinary services regarding radiation phenomena. But the initial nomination submitted by the French Academy of Sciences intentionally wrote Marie out of her own groundbreaking discovery, including only Pierre Curie and Henri Becquerel. The Academy essentially viewed her as Pierre's capable lab assistant, a staggering display of institutional misogyny. Fortunately, a sympathetic mathematician on the Nobel Committee, Magnus Gustav Mittag-Leffler, secretly tipped Pierre off about the omission. Pierre was appalled. He wrote back immediately, categorically refusing to accept the prize unless Marie was equally recognized, explicitly stating she was the originator of the hypothesis and the primary driver of the work. Because of his fierce advocacy, the committee relented, making Marie Curie the first woman in history to win a Nobel Prize. The prize instantly transformed them into global celebrities, and radium became an absolute cultural craze. Industries put it in everything. Radium toothpaste, face creams promising a glowing complexion, and water tonics meant to cure arthritis, creating a massive multi-million-dollar industry. Realizing the immense commercial value of the fractional crystallization process, the Curies made a highly debated, deliberate decision. They chose not to patent it. They firmly believed that scientific knowledge belonged to all of humanity, not to corporations. They published their exact processes step by step, completely free of charge, so anyone in the world could replicate it. They also saw its immense medical potential. Pierre had deliberately strapped a piece of radium-bearing material to his arm for several hours, giving himself a deep, severe, slow-healing radiation burn, just to clinically observe its physiological effects on living tissue. This agonizing self-experiment proved that radiation destroyed human cells. Because cancer cells divide more rapidly than normal cells, they are more susceptible to radiation damage, birthing Curie therapy, the precursor to modern radiotherapy used to shrink tumors. They knew they had something that could save lives and refused to gatekeep it behind a patent. But historically speaking, was this extreme idealism actually self-sabotage? By not patenting the process, they allowed commercial factories to make absolute millions off their intellectual property, while the Curies remained completely strapped for cash, working in a toxic, leaky shed, barely scraping by to pay for research material. They could have taken the patent money, built a state-of-the-art, properly ventilated laboratory, and dramatically accelerated their life-saving research. However, we must contextualize this within the scientific ethos of the late 19th century. Patenting a fundamental medical discovery was viewed by purists as deeply unethical, a violation of the spirit of open democratic inquiry, echoing figures like Louis Pasteur, who refused to patent his vaccines. Furthermore, there was a massive legal barrier. Under French law, specifically the doctrine of coverture, a married woman could not hold a patent or sign a legally binding contract in her own name. Any patent would have been the sole legal property of Pierre, meaning the structural reality of the era was designed to erase her ownership. Regardless of the money, by 1906 they were at the absolute pinnacle of their field. The Nobel Prize forced the university to give Pierre a proper professorship and a better laboratory. They had 2 young daughters, Irene and Eve. They had survived the shed and were finally stepping into the light, but just as life stabilized, the narrative took a horrific, violently abrupt turn. On the afternoon of April 19th, 1906, Pierre Curie was walking across the Rue Dauphine in Paris. It was a terrible day, with heavy rain and slick cobblestones. Carrying an umbrella, his mind likely lost in scientific thought, he crossed the street and slipped, or perhaps stepped out blindly to avoid a carriage, walking directly into the path of a massive, heavy horse-drawn military wagon weighing over 6 tons. He was knocked down, fell under the wheels, and the rear wheel crushed his skull. He was killed instantly on the wet pavement. He was 47 years old. The sheer randomness of it is breathtakingly cruel. The man who unlocked the invisible architecture of the atom was killed by the blunt, primitive physics of a wooden wheel and gravity. Marie was completely, fundamentally shattered, entering a state of near catatonic shock for weeks. She absolutely refused to allow a medical autopsy, kissed his blood-stained clothes, and to cope with the overwhelming grief, she began keeping a private mourning diary, addressed directly to Pierre, pouring out her raw, agonizing pain. While she grieved, the University of Paris had a highly unusual problem: what to do with Pierre's laboratory and teaching position. In an unprecedented move, the physics department at the Sorbonne decided to offer Pierre's academic chair to Marie. She accepted it not out of career ambition, but explicitly hoping to build a world-class laboratory as a living tribute to his memory. On November 5th, 1906, she delivered her first lecture. The lecture hall was packed with students, journalists, and Parisian high society, expecting a tearful, dramatic display from the grieving widow. Instead, Marie walked into the room, stared straight ahead, and began her lecture on radioactivity at the exact, precise sentence where Pierre had left off in his final class. With that stoic act, she became the first female professor in the 600-year history of the Sorbonne. An incredible professional triumph, forged entirely out of personal tragedy. But if you think the French establishment was finally going to embrace her, you are wrong. They were far from done testing her. By 1911, 5 years after Pierre's tragic death, she was undeniably the most famous and accomplished scientist in the world. She had isolated pure radium, and she had defined the international standards for measuring radiation. So, when a vacant seat in the highly prestigious French Academy of Sciences opened, Marie logically applied for membership. But there was a massive catch. The Academy, since its founding in 1666, had never admitted a woman. And the old guard of the Academy was firmly resolved not to start with her. Her candidacy instantly transcended science, detonating into a massive, highly volatile cultural flashpoint in France. To understand why, you must understand the deeply polarized political climate following the Dreyfus affair. The nation was essentially split into 2 warring factions. On one side stood the progressive, secular, Republican intellectuals who championed science and modernity. On the other side stood the deeply conservative, traditionalist, right-wing nationalists, heavily backed by the Catholic Church, who felt the moral fabric of France was being destroyed by foreigners, secularism, and the changing roles of women. Marie Curie became the ultimate proxy for this culture war. Her opponent for the Academy seat was Edouard Broglie. He was a highly competent physicist known for his early work in wireless telegraphy, work that Marconi built upon. But more importantly to his backers, he was a devout Catholic, framed as the true French patriot. The conservative press launched an absolute smear campaign against Marie. It was a vicious, deeply xenophobic, and blatantly sexist attack. They brought in pseudoscientists to analyze her handwriting and the shape of her facial features to prove she wasn't genetically French enough to represent the Academy. They deliberately spread false rumors that she was secretly Jewish, specifically to stoke the rampant anti-Semitism still boiling from the Dreyfus affair. The rhetoric was violently designed to paint her as an existential threat to the traditional French family and the moral order. They argued that elevating a secular, foreign-born woman over a devout Frenchman was a grave insult to the nation. And the campaign worked. On January 23, 1911, the Academy rejected Marie Curie by a margin of just 1 or 2 votes, handing the seat to Edouard Broglie. It was a brutal, humiliating exposure of structural bias. Deemed too foreign, too female, and too secular to be allowed into the inner sanctum of French intellect, Marie was deeply wounded and resolved never to apply to the Academy again. But this professional snub was merely the opening act, the prelude to an even more devastating, deeply personal crisis that erupted later that exact same year. The infamous Langevin scandal. Marie, now a widow in her mid-40s, carrying the immense weight of her research and single motherhood, eventually found emotional and intellectual comfort with Paul Langevin. Langevin was a brilliant theoretical physicist, a former star student of Pierre's, and a close family friend. But there was a very significant complication. Paul was married. His marriage to Jeanne Langevin was incredibly toxic, with historical sources painting a deeply unhappy home of frequent violent arguments and physical abuse going in both directions. Paul and Marie began an affair, renting a secret private apartment in Paris to meet and work. But Jeanne Langevin, highly suspicious and fully aware of the affair, went on the offensive. She hired a private investigator who actually broke into the secret apartment and stole highly intimate, passionate letters written between the two physicists. Jeanne held on to these letters, waiting for the most damaging moment to strike. And she chose her moment perfectly. In late 1911, Marie was away from Paris, attending the very first highly prestigious Solvay conference in Brussels. She was literally sitting at a table, debating quantum mechanics with the greatest minds of the era, people like Max Planck and a young Albert Einstein. While she was out of the country, Jeanne Langevin leaked the stolen letters to the French tabloids. The Parisian press absolutely erupted. The timing was explosive. The very same newspapers that had enthusiastically cheered her Nobel Prize just 8 years earlier now viciously turned on her, splashing her private life across the front pages. They branded her a foreign homewrecker, a defiler of a Christian home, and a manipulative vamp who destroyed a traditional French family. The coverage, dripping with a toxic blend of misogyny and xenophobia, became physically dangerous. When Marie returned to her home in Sceaux, she found a literal angry mob surrounding her house. They were throwing stones, shouting horrific insults, and terrorizing her 2 young daughters, Irene and Eve, who were trapped inside. The situation was so volatile that Marie was forced to pack her daughters and flee, hiding out at a friend's house in Paris just to escape the violence. The hysteria reached such a fever pitch that Paul Langevin actually ended up fighting a pistol duel with a prominent newspaper editor who had insulted Marie, though thankfully, neither man fired their weapon. There is a stark, glaring double standard applied to her identity that requires deep analytical focus. The French establishment was perfectly happy to claim her as a glorious French heroine when she was winning global accolades for the nation. But the precise moment she stepped out of the acceptable bounds for a widow, she was instantly stripped of her French identity and reduced to a dangerous, subversive foreigner. The tragic irony is profound. She dedicated her entire existence to isolating and understanding physical radioactivity, only to be nearly destroyed by the toxic social radioactivity of public opinion, and the fallout threatened to dismantle her greatest professional achievement. Right in the middle of this mob violence, the Swedish Academy made a stunning announcement. Marie Curie had won the 1911 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for her discovery of radium and polonium. This made her the first person in history to win 2 Nobel Prizes, and in 2 different scientific fields. But the Nobel Committee Chair, Svante Arrhenius, terrified of the PR disaster, wrote her an incredibly condescending letter. He essentially told her that given the circumstances, they strongly suggested she do not come to Stockholm to accept the prize, stating they did not want the King of Sweden shaking hands with an adulteress. Here, Marie Curie delivered an absolute masterclass in boundary setting and intellectual integrity. She completely refused to be shamed into the shadows. She wrote a blistering response back to Svante Arrhenius, stating unequivocally, "I cannot accept the idea that the appreciation of the value of scientific work should be influenced by libel and slander concerning private life." Completely separating her intellect from their moral policing, she traveled directly to Sweden and accepted the prize on stage with her head held high. She survived this public crucifixion, in part, because she was supported by an unexpected corner of the scientific world. In the thick of the scandal, she received a highly secretive, remarkable private letter from Albert Einstein. Einstein, who had just met her at the Solvay conference, was furious on her behalf. Writing in November of 1911, he expressed his profound respect for her pure intellect, her drive, and her scientific honesty. But it was his colorful language that stood out. He told her to ignore the rabble and explicitly called the tabloid journalists reptiles. He wrote, "If the rabble continues to occupy itself with you, then simply don't read that hogwash, but rather leave it to the reptile for whom it has been fabricated." Einstein saw her for what she was, a peerless scientist, not a tabloid caricature. Eventually, the scandal blew over, and Paul Langevin quietly settled out of court, returning to his family. But the intense, sustained stress broke Marie's physical and mental health. She suffered from severe kidney issues and a deep, crushing depression, forced to hide away in England under an assumed name for over a year to recover. But geopolitical forces do not let legends hide for long. By 1914, she had returned to her laboratory in Paris. And then World War I broke out. The German army began a terrifying march directly toward Paris, a threat so imminent that the entire French government and military command literally packed up and fled to Bordeaux. Marie refused to run. She secured the nation's scientific assets by packing the single gram of pure radium that France possessed into a heavy lead box, boarded a crowded refugee train, and personally deposited it in a bank vault in Bordeaux. The very next day, she boarded a train going in the opposite direction, returning directly to the deserted city of Paris. Looking at the incoming carnage, she immediately identified a catastrophic medical failure. Battlefield surgeons were operating entirely blind. X-ray technology existed, but an X-ray machine in 1914 was a massive, highly temperamental piece of equipment confined to major city hospitals, requiring immense amounts of stable electricity. Out on the front lines, doctors had absolutely no way to locate bullets, shrapnel, or shattered bones, leading to countless agonizing blind amputations and massive fatalities from gangrene. Marie Curie decided to solve this by bringing the hospital directly to the battlefield. She conceptualized mobile, self-contained radiography units, but the fiercely sexist French military bureaucracy rejected her. So, she bypassed them entirely. She leveraged her fame, visiting the wealthy, aristocratic socialites of Paris to literally beg for their luxury cars, their Renaults and Peugeots, and asking medical manufacturers for X-ray equipment. She did not just organize a charity drive. She engineered the solution herself. The Crookes tubes of the era required roughly 50,000 volts to fire electrons at a tungsten target to generate X-rays. To get that power in a muddy field in Flanders with no electrical grid, she attached an electrical dynamo and alternator directly to the car's engine. The kinetic energy of the spinning engine turned the dynamo, generating 110 volts, which was then run through a step-up transformer to reach the massive voltage needed for the tube. She effectively turned luxury cars into rolling power plants and radiology labs. She learned to drive, learned automotive mechanics, to clean carburetors and change tires in the mud, and studied human anatomy to read the X-rays. Bringing these retrofitted vehicles to the front lines herself, the soldiers affectionately nicknamed them the Petite Curies. Operating just behind the trenches under the threat of artillery fire, she brought her 17-year-old daughter, Irene, as a radiologic nurse. Realizing 20 cars were not enough, she established a rigorous training school in Paris, recruiting and training 150 young women volunteers in physics, mechanics, and anatomy. The woman known as a pure theorist was now a grease-covered mechanic and a commanding military logistician. By the end of the war, she had 20 mobile units and 200 fixed radiological stations. It is historically estimated that her equipment and the women she trained diagnosed and treated over 1 million wounded soldiers. 1 million men whose limbs and lives were saved because she refused to stay in a safe laboratory. She was so relentlessly dedicated to the survival of France that she even tried to melt down her 2 gold Nobel Prize medals to buy war bonds, though the National Bank respectfully refused to accept them. Fast forward to 1918. The war ended, and France was victorious. The nation was eagerly handing out the Legion of Honor to generals and politicians. So, what did the French government give Marie Curie, the woman who saved 1 million soldiers, who abandoned her vital research, who offered her literal gold to the state? They gave her absolutely zero official recognition. No medals, no honors, nothing. It was a highly toxic combination of the lingering hangover from the Langevin scandal and raw, unadulterated institutional sexism. The patriarchal establishment had been perfectly happy to utilize her genius, her labor, and her machines when the very survival of the nation was at stake. But once the crisis had passed, the government was completely unwilling to publicly, officially honor a woman who was a foreigner, a secularist, and who had so thoroughly defied their rigid social expectations regarding a woman's place in society. The soldiers in the trenches, however, knew exactly who she was and what she had done for them. The historical irony is staggering. The woman cast out by the press in 1911 as a dangerous foreign homewrecker became, through sheer force of will, the very backbone of French military medicine. But as the war ended, and we move into the 1920s, Marie faced a bizarre new battle. She was incredibly famous worldwide, her name synonymous with genius, but ironically, she was completely broke. She did not even have enough money in the budget to buy the very element she discovered, radium, to continue her cancer research at her newly founded Radium Institute in Paris. Because she had never patented the isolation process, radium was now heavily commercialized, manufactured by large corporations, primarily for medical treatments and luminescent paint. It was incredibly difficult to produce, making it one of the most expensive substances on Earth. She simply could not afford her own discovery. This is where an American journalist named Marie Maloney, known as Missy, stepped into the story. She secured an interview, realized the absolute absurdity of the situation, and returned to the United States determined to fix it. She organized a massive grassroots crowdfunding campaign, primarily targeting American women. Everyday women, teachers, nurses, housewives, pooled their spare change and small dollars to buy highly radioactive material for a scientist thousands of miles away in Paris. It worked spectacularly. By 1921, they had raised over $100,000, an astronomical sum at the time. Marie Curie traveled to the United States on a grand tour, and President Warren G. Harding personally presented her with a specialized lead-lined mahogany box containing exactly 1 gram of pure radium. It was a triumphant moment, but the grueling American tour publicly highlighted a dark reality. The severe physical toll of her life's work was becoming impossible to hide or ignore. She was frequently exhausted, appearing frail, and often had to cancel public speaking events to rest. As the 1920s progressed, her health went into a steep decline. She suffered from severe, debilitating cataracts that nearly blinded her, requiring multiple painful surgeries just so she could see her notes. She had a constant, maddening buzzing in her ears, suffered from chronic, unexplainable fatigue, and her fingertips were covered in hard, unhealing lesions. We know exactly why this was happening. In the early days of their research, they had absolutely no concept of the dangers of ionizing radiation. The safety protocols we take for granted today simply did not exist. They used to just carry glowing test tubes of concentrated radium salts around in their open lab coat pockets. Marie famously kept a vial in her desk drawer because she liked to look at the faint fairy tale blue light it emitted in the dark. The scientific and medical community at the time was almost entirely focused on the supposed health benefits of radiation to destroy cancer cells, completely missing the silent, cumulative cellular destruction it was causing to healthy tissue. Ionizing radiation essentially consists of high-energy particles that act like microscopic bullets. When they pass through the human body, they have enough energy to literally strip electrons away from atoms, breaking chemical bonds and violently shattering DNA strands. Marie Curie absorbed this energy daily for decades. Her health continued a slow, agonizing decline until the spring of 1934, when she was finally too weak to work and had to leave her beloved laboratory for the last time. She was diagnosed with aplastic anemia and died on July 4, 1934, at a sanatorium in Passy, France. Aplastic anemia is a severe, fatal condition where the bone marrow completely stops producing new blood cells. Because the hematopoietic stem cells inside the marrow are constantly, rapidly dividing, they are extraordinarily vulnerable to radiation damage. The ionizing radiation shatters the DNA in these stem cells, halting their ability to replicate. Without red blood cells, she suffered extreme fatigue. Without white blood cells, she had no immune system. And without platelets, she could not stop internal bleeding. It is a total systemic failure. The immediate global reaction was that she was a true martyr to science, that the very polonium and radium she pulled from the earth had slowly poisoned her. It is a neat, poetic, and tragic narrative. She loved the glowing radium, and the radium killed her. But our sources reveal a stunning, almost unbelievable twist to this narrative that did not emerge until decades later. In 1995, the French government decided to honor both Pierre and Marie Curie by exhuming their remains and interring them in the Pantheon in Paris, the ultimate resting place for France's greatest heroes. Marie was the first woman interred there purely on her own merit. But before moving the bodies, radiation protection officials conducted strict tests, fearing the remains would be dangerously radioactive. When they tested Pierre's remains, they were indeed heavily contaminated with radium. which makes perfect sense, given his intense work with the pure element and his sudden death in 1906, meaning the radium was locked into his bones while he was heavily active. But when they tested Marie's remains, her body did not emit the expected lethal levels of radium. The radium levels in her remains were remarkably low, far too low to have been the primary cause of death. This forces a massive, fundamental reevaluation of how she died. Living until 1934, her body actually had time to slowly excrete and eliminate much of the radioactive burden. Medical historians reviewing this radiological evidence now hypothesize that her fatal aplastic anemia was not primarily caused by her famous lifelong work with radium. This completely flips the script of scientific history. If it wasn't the glowing vials in her pocket, what delivered the fatal dose? The overwhelming evidence now points directly to her massive, unshielded, acute exposure to X-rays during World War I. For 4 years, she operated those petites Curies. She was working directly in the invisible beam of rudimentary, highly powerful X-ray tubes. She was standing over soldiers, manipulating the equipment without lead aprons, without dosimeter badges, without any modern shielding. She absorbed massive acute doses of electromagnetic radiation while peering into the bodies of those million wounded soldiers. This changes her entire legacy. It was not just her towering intellect that killed her. It was her profound empathy. It was her relentless, patriotic drive to save the lives of young men bleeding in the mud of Flanders that delivered the fatal blow to her bone marrow. She has gone down in history as the martyr of radium. But the biological truth suggests she was actually the martyr of her own humanitarianism. She gave her life not just for data, but for humanity. And while her physical body may not be highly radioactive today, her physical legacy, the objects she touched, certainly are. Her primary laboratory in Paris was so thoroughly saturated with radioactive isotopes that decades later, it required a massive, highly specialized governmental decontamination effort before it could even safely open as a public museum. Which brings us in a perfect circle, right back to the beginning of our exploration. Her laboratory notebooks, her personal papers, the wooden furniture she sat on, and yes, even her handwritten cookbooks containing recipes for stews and pastries. They are all still dangerously radioactive, contaminated primarily with radium-226, which has a half-life of 1,600 years. They are kept sealed in specialized lead boxes at the National Library in France. They will remain that way, silently glowing with invisible energy for a millennium and a half. It is a literal, physical manifestation of the permanent, radiating impact she left on the world. Her discoveries didn't just alter science. They fundamentally rewrote our understanding of the universe, paved the way for modern oncology, and simultaneously unlocked the subatomic physics that led to the terrifying dawn of the atomic age. She truly left an untouchable, complex legacy. Marie Curie once famously said, "Nothing in life is to be feared. It is only to be understood." She believed absolutely, with her entire being, in the pure, fearless pursuit of scientific knowledge. But given that the very atomic secrets she sought to understand eventually took her life and went on to birth both life-saving cancer treatments and civilization-ending atomic weapons, how do we, today, balance that pure, fearless pursuit of knowledge with the terrifying responsibility of what that knowledge might unleash upon the world once it leaves the laboratory? That is a heavy, incredible question to mull over. If you loved exploring the hidden, controversial, and brilliant corners of history with us today, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Legendary Lives Unveiled. We love bringing these incredible stories to you, and your support helps us unveil the next great life. Until next time, keep questioning the world around you.